Hey everyone, Bach Photography here, back with another video. Thank you for joining me once again. Today we're going to be looking at a review of the Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens. Now before we get into the video, make sure to check out a link in the description to a free guide that I've just made on how to take portraits at nighttime. I spent a lot of time making this ebook and I think it's going to really be helpful to anyone who's looking at taking awesome portraits at night. So now let's jump into the video and have a look at the Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens, its strengths, its weaknesses, and overall what I think of this lens. So through this video I'm going to take some photos and I'm going to leave the links to those photos in the description as well, so you can have a play with the photos, see what you think of the lens and its quality, its sharpness, that kind of thing, and also you can edit along at the end when I edit one of these photos at the end of this video. So let's talk a little bit about the specs of this lens. Well, first of all, it's a really heavy lens at 1.1 kilos or 2.5 pounds. It's also quite an expensive lens. Currently it's costing about $1,200 US, and I'll leave a link in the description again for this lens if you're looking to purchase this lens as well. So what else is there to say about this lens? Well, you can get it for Canon, Nikon or Sony. It has a maximum aperture of f1.4 and it can also be stopped down all the way to f16, but you're probably not going to be using this lens much at f16 because the optical properties it has at f1.4 and at low apertures are truly beautiful and amazing for portrait photography. So the 85mm has long been considered one of the go-to portrait lenses for portrait photographers, and the reason for that is that with an 85mm you're shooting at a small telephoto focal length, which means that you're going to kind of be cropping into your subject a little bit more than you would with a normal focal length such as 50mm or 40mm, so you're really drawing focus onto your subject, which will be your model in a portrait. Also, your background is going to seem far away because of the compression of an 85mm, particularly if you're shooting at a low aperture. When you're shooting at a really low aperture like f1.4 or f1.8, the background is really going to blow out into a creamy, blurry mess, drawing focus to your subject in the foreground. So here we have two photos that were shot in the same scene. The photo on the left was shot on a Sigma 50mm f1.4 lens, and the photo on the right was shot on the Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens. And you can see in the background, the 50mm has a blurry background for sure. They were both shot at f1.4, but the blurry background is not quite as blurry as with the 85mm. You can see the blobs of bokeh in the background on the 50mm are much smaller than the ones on the 85. You can also kind of see what's going on in the background just a little bit with the 50mm. You can see there are some kind of bushes and maybe there's like a light pole just in the middle of the 50mm, but with the 85mm you really can't see what's going on in the background and you're really drawn into the foreground of the image where the model is. So if you're looking for a lens that really draws a comparison between the blurriness of the background and draws focus into the foreground on the focal point where your subject is, an 85mm is going to do a much better job than a 50. Now a 50 is really good because you can see a bit more of the background and you can get a little bit more context about what's going on in the scene, but if you're potentially not looking for that and you're looking to really just draw focus to your model, you can shoot with an 85mm and potentially get better results. So let's get that photo on the right and really zoom in on the eye, which is where I pointed the focal point for this photo, and I was shooting at f1.4 and I'm also using a Canon version of the Sigma 85mm but on a Sony camera, so I'm going to be using the MC11 adapter, which is a Sigma product, to adapt the Sigma lens to my Sony. And what you can see here is that the eyes are absolutely tack sharp, and this lens really performs exceptionally well even at f1.4. So that is a really impressive result. Just remember though, because you're shooting at such a low aperture of f1.4, you're going to have to be a lot more precise with your focusing if you're using manual focus, and if you're using autofocus like I did here, you're going to have to make sure to stay completely still and tell your model to stay completely still when you're taking your photos, because your depth of field is going to be so shallow at f1.4, particularly with an 85mm, because the longer you go with your lens, the shallower your depth of field is going to be at any given aperture. And if you're shooting at an 85mm for headshots, that even exemplifies that problem again. So really, shooting at 85mm 1.4 at 1.4, when you're doing something like a headshot, you're really only going to get 1 or 2 millimeters of focus to nail that depth of field on your model's eyes. So now let's have a look at the unedited version of this photo, and you can see that it's quite low contrast, and because we're shooting at f1.4 on an 85mm lens, you're going to see a loss of contrast when you're shooting with backlit light. So that's something to consider if you're shooting with this lens, especially at a low aperture. You might have to add a little bit of contrast in post-production just to really make those colors pop and make your subject pop from the background of your photo. So who do I think this lens is for? Well, My personal opinion is that this lens would be for someone who's shooting on a full frame camera, who already has a few lenses. Maybe they have a 50mm, potentially they have a 35mm as well, and they're looking to get something that's more towards subject photography and portrait photography, that's going to give them a little bit more depth of field, and it's going to give them a little bit more of a focus on the subject of their photo. Now, this lens would be awesome on an APS-C camera, it would be awesome on a full frame camera, really doesn't matter. This lens, in my opinion, is really, really great, but I think it's more targeted towards people who have already got a little bit of camera equipment, already know a little bit about how their camera works and all that kind of thing, and are sort of looking to take their equipment to the next level, because there are a few cheaper options that you can go for in the 85mm range, whether you're with Canon, Nikon or Sony. The Sigma is a little bit more of a premium item, not quite as expensive as, let's say, the Canon 85 1.2, but still it's quite an expensive piece of gear. So let's have a talk about a few of the weaknesses of this lens, and some of these weaknesses aren't really the fault of Sigma or anything like that, but more just an effect of the type of lens that this is. So because it's an 85mm lens, and the focal length is quite narrow, this lens is not going to be very good in situations where you don't have very much space, because you really do have to go quite far back to get a model in frame. So if you're shooting, let's say, in a really small studio, or maybe you're shooting an indoor wedding or something like that, the 85mm might be a little bit too long for you to shoot effectively, particularly if you're not going to be shooting just headshots or something like that. So that's not really the fault of Sigma or anything like that, that's just the nature of 85mm lenses and their focal length, but it's something to consider if you're shooting indoors in tiny areas, or you're shooting weddings where you don't have much space or something like that. Potentially the 85mm is not the next lens for you to get. Another drawback with this lens is there's no image stabilization in the lens, and if you're using something like a Sony, this isn't going to be a problem because that has inbuilt image stabilization, such like the A7 series or something like that. But as you can see in this footage here, I'm having quite a difficult time keeping this lens steady and providing smooth footage for this video. Although I'm quite bad at doing steady footage for video, I don't have that much practice, but it's something to think about if you're looking to do video work. Maybe you could look at getting a lens that has inbuilt stabilization, and this Sigma 85mm is not one of those lenses that has that feature. And those two things are pretty much the only bad things that I can say about this Sigma lens. This 85mm f1.4 is actually probably my favorite lens of all time, and that's probably because I like to do portrait photography primarily, and the 85mm is the perfect portrait lens. Not only that, this Sigma is a super sharp lens, it's pretty good at focusing, it's not too heavy, although it is quite heavy, but it does provide you with super sharp images and really, really nice bokeh and out of focus backgrounds. So should you get this lens? Well, it's really up to you, but I can safely say that I would definitely recommend it for anyone who's looking to get a nice portrait lens that has beautiful bokeh and really nice sharp images. Now, this isn't the cheapest 85mm lens you can get, so if you're on a budget, this is potentially not the right lens for you. But if you're wanting something that's going to last a very long time, that's going to produce beautiful images, that's a nice rugged lens, and it's going to be capable, and also it's going to be consistent, this is the lens that I would get if I was shooting on Canon, Nikon or Sony, even more so than the 85mm 1.2 from Canon. And the reason for that is just that the 85 1.4 from Sigma provides a much better focusing experience than the Canon, and that extra 1.2 to 1.4 difference in depth of field and light performance really isn't enough for me to want to sacrifice that focusing ability. So now let's jump into Photoshop and have an edit of one of the photos in this video. Okay, here we are in Photoshop. So the first thing we're going to do is just fix the contrast and the clarity problems we're having. So just adding a whole bunch of clarity and then a whole bunch of contrast, just until we have a nice, colorful, punchy image with nice highlights and nice shadows. Next thing we're going to do is drop the highlights just so we can bring some color back into the background, and then we'll drop the whites again for the same reason, but not going too low because we still want to have some highlights on our model's face. Next thing I'm going to do is boost up the shadows and then drop the blacks, and this is just another way of getting some contrast, but we're going to be getting a different contrast in a different area of the image. Okay, so I'm just going to remove all the blues as well, because this image is going to have a color palette of green, yellow and brown, and a bit of orange as well for the skin tone, so we don't need any blue. The next thing I'm going to do is just drop the blacks and exposures, just so I can have a masking tool, and then I'm going to basically mask all of the hair. This is just so I can see exactly where I've highlighted. Once I've got a highlight of the entire hair, I'm going to add a bit of clarity just to boost the high-end highlights and also the shadows, and we're also going to change the color balance as well just a little bit so that the hair is a little bit more yellow and it looks like the sun is hitting it a little bit more. Because when we were shooting this photo, we're still a couple hours away from sunset, so we weren't at the perfect time for golden hour, so we kind of just have to add that back in post-production. So now what we're going to do is just add a little bit more punch and contrast to the eyes, the nose and the lips, because these are the areas that you're going to be drawn to as the viewer of this image. So we're just getting another paintbrush and basically adding in some contrast and clarity with our paintbrush. So that looks about right. Let's just remove that color balance change as well. So we'll reset our brush tool now. And the next thing we're going to do is just smooth the skin. So I'm going to drop the exposures and blacks once again, just so I can see where exactly I'm clicking and changing on the scene. And basically we're just going to do a very rough pass of smoothing the skin by reducing the clarity. Now if you were going to edit this for publication, or you were doing this for something like a client, you probably wouldn't want to use this technique. You'd want to use frequency separation, which is something I'm going to do a little bit later on in the video, but this is just, in the interest of time, a great way of really smoothing out skin in 30 seconds or less. So I'm just highlighting all the areas here that I'd like to smooth, so basically avoiding any lines that I want to keep sharp, like the lips, the eyes, the nostrils, the eyebrows, that kind of thing, and also the jawline as well. And then any parts that I want to be smooth, like the skin, we're going to smooth all of that out by reducing the clarity in the image. So now I've removed those blacks and exposures. You can see here this is what it looks like with more or less clarity. I'm just going to drop it about 20 to 30 points. If you go too far with this, your model starts looking like they have porcelain skin, and that's not what we want in this photo. So now I'm just going to make it look even more like golden hour by adding a little bit more brightness and yellow tones into the background. You've got to be careful with this not to add too much, because then it'll look unnatural, but just adding a little bit more light to the background can really add some depth to your image. So that's everything we're going to do in Camera Raw. The next thing we're going to do is just touch up any of the skin here. And I'm just going to speed through this because it's a little bit boring and you've probably seen it all before. So we're just going to spend a couple minutes removing any blemishes that we see on the skin. Okay, so that's everything for skin retouching. Now what we're going to do is use the liquify tool, and we're just going to pull out the hair a little bit to make it look a little bit more thick and a little bit more full. And this is something that I think works in any situation with any model. Just adding a little bit more fullness to the hair always makes a big difference to the final image. Just make sure you don't do too much warpage and make the scene look unnatural. These are all really small changes that all are going to add up at the end. So this is before and after. You can really see a big difference in the hair here. So that is everything for this photo. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Remember, there are links to the raw files down below if you would like to edit this yourself. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of the edits that you guys do and send me on Instagram. I really do enjoy looking at them and seeing the differences that you get to in the final product compared to me. That's always a real kick. So please send them to me. I'm really looking forward to that. Also, check out my How to Shoot Portraits at Night guide. That's going to be in the description as well. I really hope that's informative and interesting. If you got this far and haven't subscribed, what are you doing? You need to subscribe. Please hit that subscribe button and hit the bell if you haven't already. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.